Hi, friends. So some of you have seen the 3 or 4 videos I've made on the topic of free will, in which I sort of argue that free will is an illusion. And some of you ask the intelligent question, wait, how is this argument that free will is an illusion compatible with the doctrine we find in non-dual Shaiva Tantra called Swatantriyavada, the doctrine of radical freedom, radical autonomy, the innate, free, independent autonomy of consciousness. And this is indeed an absolutely key and indispensable doctrine of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, that consciousness, trans-individual awareness, the awareness by virtue of which all aware beings are aware, is innately free and autonomous. And so this would seem to contradict this argument about free will as an illusion. Well, it doesn't. And that's very interesting. So I want to take a few minutes to explain that. So the argument that free will is an illusion is exactly the same as the argument that there's no such thing as a separate self, which is an independent chooser. Okay, so I'll get into this, but the problem is that when people hear the phrase free will, that triggers all sorts of ideas in their head. And when we're arguing that free will is an illusion, people don't get what that really means. They think that means we're saying that your experience of choosing is an illusion. You don't really choose, or that choice isn't really yours. And in a way, that is what we're saying, but not in the way that you think. In other words, let's put it more simply. There is no separate self that stands outside the matrix of cause and effect that determines everything that happens, right? Every effect that appears has a prior cause, or rather not one cause, but a vast matrix of causes, factors that come together to produce that particular effect. And that's just as much true of every choice that you make as anything else, right? So if you say, well, yeah, I perfectly accept that my whole background and my psychology and the preferences innate to this organism, this body, are very much a part of my choice, then yeah, you're actually agreeing that, because we're simply saying, we meaning me and others who argue this, that when choice occurs, that it occurs within and as a part of that matrix of cause and effect that brings about everything that occurs, and that you can't stand outside of that in any way. You can't make some choice that's free, meaning to say completely independent of all the causes and conditions that are influencing the experience of choosing. Okay, so the important thing here is that the illusion of free will and the illusion of separate self are really one and the same illusion, right? So the mind, the ego, if you will, wants to imagine that it is separate from and stands apart from everything, and then can act on and influence everything. But that, of course, is a complete sheer nonsense imagination, right? So now, how does this tie into that doctrine I mentioned earlier of Swatantriyavada in Sanskrit, radical autonomy of awareness? People say, well, if awareness per se is radically free, autonomous, and independent, doesn't that mean that we all are? Yes, exactly. But not in the way that you think, because you imagine yourself to be a separate self. That fictitious construct, that mental construct, has no real power because it is just a thought, and thoughts don't have power. Thoughts are effects, not causes. Right. So it's a little bit more complicated than that because thoughts are embedded in a causal matrix. But we can say, to simplify, that they are, for the most part, effects more than they are causes. Right. So we see this in the fact that you decide to do something and then you rationalize it, you justify it after the fact. Even the thought, I chose this, comes after the choice is already made, right? So the attribution of the action to a chooser comes after the fact, right? And when people say, why did you do that? We create a story, and that story might have, some grains of truth in it if we're self-reflective enough to understand something of the motives that are in operation in our own organism, right? But largely, it's a confabulation. We confabulate a reason why we did something because we don't really have a conceptual understanding of it. We have more of a speculation about it, which again might have grains of truth. Now, so how is all of this expressing radical freedom? Well, we have to ask, to whom does that radical freedom belong? The tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra says it belongs to the one actor, the one agent of all actions that the tradition calls Shiva. And that's, in this context, simply a word that means something like God. That is to say, the single trans-individual consciousness by virtue of which all conscious creatures are conscious to whatever degree that they are. So the tradition very clearly says agency belongs to Shiva, not to the individual self, because the individual self is a fiction, except insofar as it's understood to be a manifestation, an expression, an extrusion, if you will, of that one consciousness, which is that which is giving rise to everything. Okay, so in other words, to say that you choose freely whatever you choose, you can say that if you want, but it's would be the same as saying you choose to shine the sun, you choose to blow the wind, you choose to turn the earth, you choose to change the seasons. That is to say, the one autonomous trans-individual awareness is giving rise to all phenomena, not in some predetermined way, right? Because this isn't a mind in that sense that chooses ahead of time how things will be amongst other options. No, it spontaneously gives rise to all observable phenomena as an expression of its own essence nature. So if you say, no, I don't choose to shine the sun or blow the wind or any of those things, well, then you don't choose anything else either, because it's all chosen. Those movements that we call choices, those movements of the will, of desire that gets translated into action, those all arise spontaneously, in the sense that you can't ever give an accounting for why you chose this versus that. Well, you might say, yes, I can, because I prefer that. Well, but that's just begging the question. You can't give an explanation for why you prefer this versus that. You can't give an explanation for why this movement of the will arose when it did and not at some other time. You can't explain why the movement of the will arises with precisely the strength that it does, enough strength to be translated into action or not, enough strength to be translated to action for a given duration of time. None of that is explicable. None of that is understandable, at least not to the mind. So we can't give an accounting that's at all satisfactory of why we choose anything, because if you think you can, you just look at, well, what's the root of that choice, right? It is the arising of some desire or movement of the will or spontaneous expression, none of which are chosen in advance. They simply are there. They simply appear, and in that sense, those movements of energy are just like everything else in the entire universe. Everything appears the way that it does. And we can draw maps of associations, right? We can explain how some phenomena relate to other phenomena, but we can never give an accounting for why the universe should be structured in that way and not some other way, right? So, of course, all of this is talking in terms of a particular way of looking at reality, which is the linear time model, in which effects succeed causes in linear time. And that's for sure not the only way to experience reality. And if you experience reality in this atemporal way, then this model all completely goes out the window. But since most people experience in terms of this linear time, a succession of events, then it makes sense to address it. Okay, so let's come to the real gem here, which is simply this. That which is, whether we call it God or consciousness or beingness, arises as all phenomena whatsoever, including your desires, your will, your preferences, and all of that is the expression of the freedom of the absolute, the freedom of this divine consciousness, if you want to call it that, this trans-individual awareness that we become intimate with in a process of meditation that fructifies in what we call realization, but which anyone can be intimate with if they simply become curious enough about their own nature to become aware of awareness, to become aware of that which is constant in their experience. Okay, so in other words, when people are experiencing what they call a lack of freedom, that is an expression of the freedom of consciousness. Consciousness is so free, it is free to experience itself as bound, as limited, and it does. And then it's free to shed that experience once again, and it does, inevitably, right? The limitations of experience are the limitations on the nature of experience are shed in the process of spiritual awakening or in the process of death. Sooner or later, those limitations are shed. So it's not to say, if you're awake to your true nature, that then, oh, you can do anything. No, because the body, the organism, has the same sorts of limitations that it always did. But the way in which you experience reality moment to moment is radically different because it's unbounded. It's not constrained by self-image, by the sense of separate self, which turns out to have been an illusion. So, in other words, the autonomy in question belongs not to the illusory separate self, which after all is an effect, not a cause, right? This illusion of separate self is affected by a whole bunch of complex causes, right? So the autonomy in question belongs to the cause of all phenomena, and that is consciousness. As it's said in the first sutra of the recognition sutras, the Pratibhijna Hridaya, Chitti Swatantra Vishvasiddhi Hetuhu. Consciousness or awareness, free and independent, is the cause of the performance of everything, the cause of the manifestation of everything, the cause by which everything attains its nature. Okay, that's what that sutra means. So it is consciousness, trans-individual awareness, that is autonomous and free. And it produces the effect of all experience whatsoever, the totality of experience. So the illusion of separate self, the shining of the sun, the blowing of the wind, the falling of the rain, all of it. Okay, so if you want to experience the radical freedom that the tradition is talking about, you don't experience it by reinforcing the sense of separate self, because that's not where that freedom is to be found, right? So this, of course, cuts against the doctrine of individuality that is central to the modern West and to the capitalist system, because that system wants to picture the individual, that is to say, the separate self, as a free agent for various ideological and economic reasons. Okay, but that's not where anyone has ever found true freedom. They find it, we find it, in reposing in our true nature, being that which we already really are. We could say fully inhabiting our true nature, which is the same as saying shedding misidentification, shedding the illusion of identification with an imagined separate self uh, 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 within a body mind, or identification with the body mind. So it's very simple, actually. It's very simple once it's understood, and there is no contradiction whatsoever um, between saying that the separate self doesn't have free will in the way it thinks it does, right? And saying that consciousness is radically free. It is freely giving rise to the experience you're having right now. And it can freely give rise to any sort of experience. And then you might say, well, why don't I have a completely different sort of experience in the next moment? Well, you might, but the movement into the experience of your radical freedom is very much tied to and dependent on your realization of your true nature, because the misunderstanding about what you are creates the illusion of limitation or bondage, which feels like the opposite of freedom. In fact, there is still freedom. Uh, you're freely choosing that experience, not on the level of the mind, the separate self, but on the deepest level. And when there's a turn at the deepest level of your being, uh, away from that experience of limitation and towards something else, that's when the spiritual path really begins in earnest, when we become more interested in the truth of our fundamental nature than anything else. And we can never account for why that turn happened when it did and not at some other time, right? But we can say it was a movement at the deepest level of our being, but there's no independent separate self choosing this. And we see that very clearly in retrospect, if not in the moment. Anyway, hope that helps clear this up a little bit. There's some interesting lighting in this video. That's okay. Hope you all are well. Hope you're enjoying the podcast here on YouTube. Almost all of my releases now are just episodes of my new podcast. And that's because the podcast is where I'm putting my attention, and it's very much worth listening to. The content is at least as good or better than all my YouTube videos previously. And you don't really need video. It's it's nice to just listen while you go for your walk or do your dishes or whatever, or just sit quietly, right? So it's a conscious choice to move away from this video medium here on YouTube, but I'm still going to share some things from time to time. And so, yeah, I hope you subscribe and stay subscribed to the channel and share it with your friends and colleagues, whoever else, and continue to enjoy the podcast. We have another great episode coming up this week. Take care.